Thank you for having me back. I'm Sarah Kornfield. I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning to think about the history of women preaching in America, to celebrate Women's History Month with you all. The teaching I had prepared for us this morning is pretty dry. It's a little academic. And as I went over it this morning, I was thinking, is this really what we're doing? But then my children came in, and so it was what we were going to do. But then, babies, as you sang, and help me with the line, I think you said we're trying to feel something in our bodies? Yeah. And in our meditation charity, the idea of the lineage, right, of our mothers, has brought me back to something maybe a little bit different as I shape our teaching here together. So to get started, I want to share a quote that we had in the pre-talk. It comes from the French feminist Hélène Cixous, and she says, you must write. She's speaking specifically to women. She says, you must write yourselves. You must write from your own bodies. We must write about women and bring women to writing, from which women have been driven away as violently as from their bodies, and for the same reasons, and by the same fatal law with the same fatal goal. Writing is for you, you are for you, your body is yours, take it. So, we're going to think together today about how women have written themselves, about women's bodies while they preach, and what it would mean to take it, to be for you, to feel something in your bodies, to feel your mother. So, in 1636, Anne Hutchinson asked, if any come to my house to be instructed in the ways of God, what rule have I to turn them away? This was her defense. She was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and she was exiled for pastoring a church in her home. Specifically, she was exiled for preaching. Using rather selective interpretations of Paul's epistles in the New Testament, some Christian traditions and denominations have always closed the pulpit to women. Others, such as the Nazarenes and other Wesleyan traditions, have always opened the pulpit to women. And others have changed with the proverbial times. For instance, the Evangelical Free Church explicitly opened the rules of ordination in order to include women in 1925 during a revival tent era, right? They needed more preachers. So there it was. And then with the rise of the religious right, they forbid women's ordinations in 1988. The Southern Baptist Convention similarly stopped ordaining women in 1984, defrocking women, revoking their ordinations, and additionally removing women from teaching positions in seminaries. Christian traditions have often associated women with the body. This will be a double-edged sword, and we're going to look at the sad side of it first. So the Christian tradition has often associated women with the body, with nature, with a sort of primitive or animalistic emotional state. In common science parlance, we would now say driven by their hormones. But other people had meaner things to say about it. Okay, meanwhile, men are associated with rationality, order, and the mind. And this means that within much of Western Christian thought, women's bodies have been historically considered, and this is a direct quote, conduits of sin. The closer you were to a woman's body, the closer you, proverbially a man, were to temptation, and therefore the closer you were to damnation. For example, Catholic abbots have refused authority over convents of nuns, lest the, quote, wickedness of women contaminate them. And even today, Mike Pence follows the Billy Graham rule by refusing to dine alone in public with women, right? I saw this on a very colloquial level in my own college experiences. I went to a small Christian liberal arts college where my faculty wouldn't have closed-door office hour meetings with me, which, kind of makes it hard to discuss grades, but that's past now, for me, at least. All of this leads to a reality in which today less than 25% of the Christian clergy are women in the United States. And that number doesn't account for who is ordained and who is not, nor does it account for who might be a preaching pastor. For instance, in the church I normally attend, we have 7 pastors on staff. We're a large church, and 2 of them are women, so that's 28%. But only 1 of them preaches with any regularity, so that's actually 14%. Right? And yet, our mothers preached. The history of U.S. rhetoric is littered with women's sermons. Women like Anne Hutchinson in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Women like Sarah Townsend, who preached in the 1790s in New York at the New Light Baptist Church. Women like Harriet Livermore, who began to preach in 1821 and who was so famously good at preaching that she was invited 4 times to preach for the U.S. Congress. Women like Zilpha Elaw and Maria Stewart, who were both free African Americans who preached abolitionist and women's rights sermons despite the threat of capture and enslavement. Women like Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who preached even when crowds attacked their halls, throwing stones at them and famously burning the Pennsylvania Hall to the ground in their wake. Women like Amy Semple McPherson, who led a revival tent ministry in the Second Great Awakening. Our mothers preached. Some of them were welcomed in their communities and had long and fruitful ministries, and some of them were ridiculed, reviled, exiled, and murdered. But they preached. I'm a rhetorician, and rhetoric is the study of how people use words, visuals, and other symbols in order to entreat, in order to inform, and in order to persuade one another in public. And what I'd like to do with you today is look specifically at the rhetorical resources, at the arguments and the speaking styles that our preaching foremothers used in order to establish their preaching authority and to construct their sermons across time. So, historically, there are 4 trends that women use when they argue for their own authority as preachers in Christian communities. The first is to claim a prophetic role. They argue that their authority and their very words come from God themselves. And they position themselves as God's messengers. So situating themselves in this way lets women sidestep a couple pitfalls, right? First of all, they sidestep the accusation that they are preaching because they just want attention or because they want power. Or they say, no, I'm only here because God sent me. This also helps them sidestep the accusation that they don't have credentials. Who are you to speak to us? You're not ordained. And they say, it's God speaking to you. Okay. So women, when they preach this way, they almost always cite Acts 2, 17 and 18. I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, even my servants, both men and women. I will pour out my spirit. The second thing that women do as they make the case for women preachers is that they center their sermons and their scriptures around scriptures that depict women as leaders. So around figures like Deborah, Mary Magdalene, Priscilla, and Junia. Third, women preachers identify patriarchy and racism as sins. And here they're usually contrasting the current church with the church as it's described in Scripture, and they argue that the early church had women leaders, right? So they're essentially saying the reason that the pulpit is closed to me is because we've gone astray. The reason that the pulpit is closed is because we have become sexist and become racist when the early church was not. All right, and then finally, women preach in a vernacular style, fancy words that actually mean they speak casually. Right? They historically, preaching by men has been formal, used really classical rhetorical patterns, and it's often read from a manuscript. But when women preach, they are usually conversational, and they are trying to engage the audience. It's a much more approachable style that women tend to use when they're preaching. These 4 styles are present in women's sermons since 1636 to today. When arguing for women's authority as preachers, women have produced really brilliant sermons. Strong argumentation, scriptural evidence, eloquent presentations, approachable. Women have left no stone unturned. And yet the bulk of U.S. history has turned women away from the pulpit. When I first learned this history, I was really disheartened because I was working on a project analyzing a sermon by Sarah Bessey, who's the author of Jesus Feminist, and I was kind of like, she's doing it! Like, wow, look at her go! Like, this sermon's amazing! If people hear this, it's going to change things! I was pretty excited because I was like, look what she does! She cites from Scripture, she's talking about Mary Magdalene, she positions herself as a prophetic voice, right? I was like, yes! All of this is happening, like, this is the argument that's going to make a difference! And then I did my research and I found out that all the things I thought were amazing from her sermon were the exact same things that women have been doing in their sermons for the last 400 years. And that was a real downer. What the history means is that a great orator who preaches the right sermon, which is what I was holding out hope for, maybe a great sermon will save us, right? Well, no, because we've had that great sermon for 400 years. So this is a pretty depressing truth. There's nothing women can do. There's nothing women haven't already done. The problem lies with culture, not with women. But there is some cause for optimism, and that's because the culture actually is shifting. If you look at the rhetorical culture, what sermons sound like in the church, the culture actually is shifting. And so here we have some optimism. Okay. To understand the change, we have to talk a little bit more about rhetorical styles. I did warn you. This one's pretty academic here. But here we go. A rhetorical style is how someone sounds. It is the organizational patterns, the word choices that make up their rhetoric. Yes. So women in America have been preaching, teaching, and politicking when it was not permitted. Right? Angelina and Sarah Grimke are run out of town. People set fire to their buildings because it's not permitted for them to speak. And yet, women continue to preach, teach, and politic even when our communities seek to silence us. Perhaps by calling us Pocahontas, for a recent example. Speaking in these conditions is tricky at best, and it is dangerous at worst. But women have adapted to these conditions, and they use rhetorical strategies to make themselves heard. The communication style that they've been using forever now is identified by the scholar Carlin Kors Campbell, and it's named the feminine rhetorical style. And this is what it's like. It's in your bulletin notes. I'll go through it, but here's what happens. The woman who wants to speak in this sort of setting adopts a very feminine role. She's going to speak as a wife. She's going to speak to you as a mother, right? And sometimes a sort of ungendered role, like that prophet figure. A woman using a feminine rhetorical style is going to use feminine examples and imagery throughout. For instance, she might draw on really domestic metaphors or like flowers. So throughout the speech or the teaching, everything might be like sweeping or blooming, right? Okay, so lots of things associated with women. She's going to tell personal stories, and she's going to use an intimate tone. She'll tell you about how she gave birth, maybe, right? Or she'll tell you about a conversation that she had with her child during her speech. She's going to use intimate asides as well. So she'll let you in on a little secret, right? So she'll be rolling along in her speech, and then she'll be like, by the way, I really do love bread. And then she'll be back at it, right? Like, I mean, it's fitting in context. I don't know why I picked bread this morning, but I do love bread. Right, so she'll have these sort of asides that let you in on something intimate, okay? And then she'll be really conversational, encouraging audience participation. Not that she's looking for a Q&A necessarily, but rather she's speaking conversationally, and she'll say things that would prompt from the audience. So she'll say things like, now you probably want to know more about, and then she'll continue as if it was a conversation. And then, and this is my favorite, she will use what's known as inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when a speaker tells stories and examples, and usually not just one example, but example after example after example, and it's going to lead to a generalized conclusion. So this is how I was taught inductive reasoning. My dissertation advisor did this, literally on stage. She goes, I'm going to eat a little green apple. Ew! Yes, stop. Oh, another little green apple. Stop. Another little green apple. Stop. And then the light bulb comes on and you go, what if all little green apples are stop? Right? So example, 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 generalized conclusion. here's the thing. If you give enough examples, if you do this right, the audience is going to get to the conclusion before you have to say it aloud. Right? The audience is going to figure out, all green apples are sour. Right? And what this does for the speaker is that when she finally says her point, the audience is going to be like, oh yeah, I knew that. She agrees with me. Right? It's a way to teach and to preach without ever asserting authority. In fact, it looks like the audience got there first, right? Okay, so the audience says, yeah, I already knew that. Okay, Michelle Obama is perhaps a really great example of someone who uses the feminine rhetorical style to great effect. In contrast, the masculine rhetorical style is clear and direct. The speaker speaks from a position of authority. They use linear arguments and deductive reasoning. Sherlock Holmes is our best example of deductive reasoning. So think of it like you make sort of universal claims about like wind patterns or rain or smoke or whatever if you're Sherlock Holmes, and then you look at a tiny little piece of evidence that nobody else has seen, and then voila! Here's this big, shocking conclusion that everyone's blown away by. Oh, the brilliance. Okay, that's how deductive reasoning works. And so the masculine style uses deductive reasoning. It often directly engages in confrontation and counter-arguing. So not that they often necessarily are debating with someone else on stage, but rather instead of saying the feminine style, which is like, now I guess maybe you all want to know more about this. Instead, the speaker would say things like, now my opponent will tell you, blah, 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 but he's wrong for 3 reasons. First, right? That's that sort of counter-arguing style. All right, and then additionally, the masculine rhetorical style sometimes uses crude or harsh language. Hillary Clinton is a great example of the masculine rhetorical style. Right? That's how she speaks. So this is an important point. The styles are not actually linked to our biology, right? Being a woman doesn't make me use the feminine rhetorical style. Women can use any style they're trained in, or any style they have a natural talent for, and same for men. It's just that when women use the masculine style, well, they tend to get dismissed as power hungry, as monstrous, as just plain bad. Yeah, in many ways that's because when women use the masculine rhetorical style, it is obvious that they are experts who are comfortable with their own authority, and society tends to respond by putting them in their place, by denying them the right to exercise that authority. In contrast, when women use the feminine rhetorical style, they are not claiming authority for themselves, nor do they present themselves as experts. Essentially, they are not a challenge. And so it's in this way that women historically have had access to the pulpit and to other spheres of influence using the feminine rhetorical style. They're able to stand at the front of the room and not present themselves as a challenge, not present themselves as disruptive, right? They're able to get their points across, they're able to persuade, they're able to delight, they're able to teach. All the while, they don't sound, at least in the church, like what you think a sermon's going to sound like. Right? Because they're not using that masculine style, which if they did, would get them run out of town. Okay, so here's the thing. Feminine rhetorical style is actually just plain brilliant communication, and lots of men have been using it since at least the 1970s. For all of Ronald Reagan's tough policies, he used the feminine rhetorical style to sell them on national television. In a similar way, starting in the 1970s, preaching handbooks and textbooks in seminaries changed and began to recommend things like this. Use inductive reasoning, engage the audience, focus on storytelling, preach in a personal tone, right? So in short, since the 1970s, preachers have been encouraged to use what we know as the feminine rhetorical style. And now if you visit a church, that's probably what you're going to hear, regardless of who might be preaching. So what does this mean? It means that the style in which women have so powerfully preached in U.S. history has actually embedded itself in the psyche of the Christian church. It means that women have been preaching so eloquently and for so long that we've carved our sermons into the church's imaginations. It means that there's an actual cultural shift. It means that when women use the feminine rhetorical style from the pulpit today, their style is no longer at odds with what the congregation expects to have heard in the style of preaching. This is at least a validation of women preachers' rhetorical brilliance. The strategies that they developed and adopted are now widely used, and this is cause for optimism. It is a cultural shift toward the values and the styles that women have long championed. And so as we celebrate Women's History Month, we celebrate women's creativity and determination. We celebrate the feminine rhetorical style. And maybe we celebrate women writing themselves. Maybe we celebrate the body, all of our bodies. Maybe we celebrate the knowledge that we can share together without needing to be an authority.